welcome. I'm Pia and you're watching NewsX. Now, in the recent past, NewsX has made a huge effort to make sure that the victims of the Kanishka bombings receive justice. The campaign finally saw an impact as a 1-minute silence was observed in both the Lok Sabha as well as the Rajya Sabha. NewsX has campaigned for a similar silence to be held after Canada observed 1 minute of silence for Khalistani terrorist Nijjar's killing anniversary. That is the difference between India and Canada. Of course, while Canada hails a terrorist, India is hailing the victims and the innocent lives that were lost nearly 40 years ago. Let's in fact listen in to an excerpt of a telecast done just last week wherein we campaigned for the Indian parliamentarians to host a 1-minute silence, and of course you've seen the result.
So should India's parliament take a minute of silence for the Kanishka victims on the 39th anniversary of this terror attack?
The Indian Parliament must take up and very strongly and condemn the action of the Government of Canada.
Kanishka being an Indian aircraft, all the innocent victims who perished in that terror attack were technically on Indian territory.
Not only we should commemorate it in the Parliament, but also we should invite the ambassadors of Canada, United States, the other Five Eyes countries and all the countries of European Union.
आयरलैंड में AI-182 कनिष्क में विस्फोटक के कारण 329 निर्दोष लोगों ने अपनी जान गंवाई थी, जबकि जापान में ऐसी एक और बड़ी तबाही टल गई, लेकिन इसमें भी 2 अन्य लोगों की मृत्यु हो गई। ये घटनाएं इस बात का स्मरण कराती है कि विश्व को आतंकवाद और हिंसक चरमपंथ के प्रति शून्य सहिष्णुता क्यों बरतनी चाहिए। इसे किसी प्रकार से क्षमा नहीं किया जा सकता, न ही न्यायोचित ठहराया जा सकता। अब ये सभा दिवंगत आत्माओं की स्मृति में कुछ देर मौन रहेगी।
Honorable members, June 23, 2024 marked the anniversary of one of the darkest days in the fight against terrorism. 2 Air India aircraft flying out of Canada were targeted by terrorists. 329 innocent people lost their lives when Air India 182 Kanishk was blown off Ireland on June 23, 1985. 2 others were killed as another major catastrophe was narrowly averted in Japan. Regrettably, justice was never fully served in these cases. These incidents are a grim reminder of why the world must show zero tolerance towards terrorism and violent extremism. Such acts can never be condoned or justified or countenanced under any pretext. Honorable members, in a tragic fire accident that took place on 12th June 2024 in a residential building labor housing facility in Mangaf area of Kuwait, 49 persons, including 45 Indians, lost their lives and more than 50 persons got injured. The loss of precious lives in this tragic incident is indeed painful and unfortunate. Our embassy in Kuwait, in coordination with the local authorities, has ensured safe evacuation and necessary assistance to those injured from the accident site and immediate repatriation of the mortal remains of the deceased to our country. This House joins me in expressing heartfelt condolences as well as deep sympathy to the families of those who lost their lives and wishes early recovery of those injured. I request members to rise in their places and observe silence as a mark of respect to the memory of those who lost their lives in these tragic incidents.
All right, there of course, viewers, what you've just seen is the impact that NewsX has created after a concerted and continuous effort, a consistent effort in order to ensure that the victims of the Kanishka bombing, those innocent lives that were lost nearly 4 decades ago, are remembered by our parliamentarians. India, of course, sending a very strong message with this. Joining us on the broadcast today is Monica Verma, foreign affairs expert, as well as Daniel Boardman, senior correspondent at the National Telegraph. First of all, I'd like to thank you both for taking our time speaking to us on the broadcast today. My very first question to Monica Verma. Ma'am, this is of course the culmination of NewsX's campaign, but justice has still not been served. The perpetrators are still roaming free. Most of them have been acquitted, some of them still roaming free on Canadian soil. Canada, of course, has consistently hosted Khalistanis on their soil, whether it is tolerating terror acts as well as tolerating the referendums that they've been holding on their soil. Now our parliamentarians, in their approach, united approach, have taken a stance. Do you think India has finally sent out a message to the world, has sent out a message that, look, there is a crystal clear difference between the ideals and the values that we stand for and that which Canada stands for?
Definitely, first of all, I must start with appreciating your effort in leading a concerted campaign to make sure that there is a moment of silence which is marked in the Indian Parliament. And I think that was very necessary, looking at the visuals that came from Canada, the unfortunate and the tragic visuals of, the Canadian parliamentarians paying one moment of silence for someone who is a Khalistani terrorist. So I think this does not balance out, because ultimately, what a perpetrator does and what a victim is doing can never be balanced. But still, a strong message at least has been sent to the entire world that, look, something so terrible happened in 1985. And not only the perpetrators, like you said, are still out on the run, but still the Canadian government has not changed one bit since the 1980s, all through the 90s, and now in 2024, that they still support and they still protect people who are doing grave injustice to their fellow human beings. So I think this is one message that has gone out to the world. And for people who are young, who won't remember this, but the investigation in this particular Kanishka bombing was all washed up. There was an extradition request from India, and it was rejected by the Canadian government, which incidentally was being led by Trudeau Sr., father of the current Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And he had, his government had requested, had rejected India's request on a very, very frivolous ground. It said that India, despite being a part of the Commonwealth, is not, entitled to hold this request, because we do not agree that Queen is the head of the state. We only agree that Queen is the head of the Commonwealth. So this was the frivolous ground on which one of the main accused, Parmar, was not extradited to India. But as things had to pan out, few years later, in the 90s, he tried to illegally enter Punjab via the Pakistani side, and that is when the Indian police took him out. So I think all of this points to a big nexus between not just, a state sponsor of terrorism like Pakistan, but a so-called country which is releasing reports on human rights treatment in India and is constantly, meddling in India's internal affairs. That same country which prides itself on the Western humanitarian concern and Western humanitarian values is one country which is supporting Khalistanis all throughout, from the 1980s to the 2024 today.
All right, I'd like to take this conversation across to Daniel Boardman, who's joining us as well. Sir, thank you for taking our time and speaking to us. We've seen considerable coverage in the international media when Trudeau had made those allegations against India in the Canadian Parliament. And we'd also, in fact, seen considerable coverage in the international media when there was a silence that was held for this terrorist Niger in the Canadian Parliament. But there is a crystal clear difference with regards to the coverage now. There is absolutely zero coverage in the international media when the Indian Parliament has been holding a 1 minute silence for all of those victims who had lost their lives. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, I mean, if you wanted the only media that would possibly cover that story would be Canada. I mean, it should be the Canadian media, right? This is the worst terrorist attack in our history. And if I would say, I wouldn't expect the Canadian media that didn't cover the should-be scandal, that we didn't honor. Like, if the Canadian media isn't willing to call out the baseline fact that we honored a man who supported the Air India bombing quite openly and its masterminds, and we didn't support the victims in our own parliament, right? If the Canadian media, for the mainstream at least, was willing to just ignore that, it would make sense that these same people are also not going to cover the fact that the Indian parliament sent the right message and decided to honor the victims of this. And we're the two countries involved, right? Talked about it's an Indian aircraft. There were Indian citizens on it, much more Canadians. But this is sort of the pattern of behavior, especially for this Trudeau government. My colleague laid out that there has been a long history of sort of negligence, let's say, being charitable on the Khalistani issue from Canada. But there's been a significant spike in, or a flip from what's turned from, we could say, maybe just negligence to willful negligence to the Trudeau administration having, high-level Khalistani infiltration. I mean, among other things. But this is where it's gone from not just negligence, where it's sort of, now we're pushing it at the highest levels, right? There should never have been a moment of silence for a man who is the self-appointed head of the Khalistan Tiger Force, whose own Gurdwara has a float of Indira Gandhi being assassinated, parked outside, like all day, every day. This is not the guy that we should be having the moment of silence for. I mean, I had a friend personally who was killed by foreign interference by an actual hostile government, the Islamic Republic of Iran. He's never gotten a minute of silence. And this is sort of on pattern of behavior for the Trudeau government, where the message must be that, the real victims of terrorism are the terrorists and their supporters because they suffer racism and accusations. And at best, you could say there's people in the Trudeau government who feel like they're valiantly fighting racism by embracing the worst of humanity, and in some way their kindness and magnanimous attitude will change these people and turn them into upstanding citizens. Maybe there's people who think that, but there's also a strong push of people who have radical ideologies in our parliament. There's currently a scandal in Canada where there's eight MPs, at least, named in an internal intelligence report that are suspected of foreign interference on behalf of a foreign government. And we're not even releasing the 8 MPs. So this is already what we have within the Liberal Party. We have 8 suspected, let's be honest, traitors, and a history of negligence on this issue.
Indeed, and why do you think the Trudeau government is giving space to these Khalistani terrorists to operate on Canadian soil? Does he see some domestic gains that he's making?
I mean, the gains from the way to it's weird because the way to manipulate the Canadian electoral system is sort of on a candidate level, which is very regional. So you can make gains in stuffing your candidates. There's sort of a myth of like the Khalistani electoral appeal, where like, oh, you can conglomerate the Sikh vote because the Sikhs, right, a majority are not Khalistani, but you do have a couple hardline radical Gurdwaras, which can, in sort of small scenarios, like a school trustee, or if you want to like get a nomination race, right, you can kind of stuff those and go there. The answer to sort of why is more in the Khalistani success, which patterns onto other groups, but they've managed to get in with the ideological left and institutions and universities. The foment critical race theory and all these different theories, right? The Khalistanis have managed to map onto the oppressor-oppressed thing. It's quite easy to sell. We're oppressed, we're Sikhs. In India, which is majority Hindu, therefore they're the many, we're the few. Very easy. The 1980s, we cut out all the bad things the Khalistanis did. We say it was a genocide, blah, 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 blah. You map it perfectly onto all the talking points. So they've sort of, over the decades, they've gotten themselves into the institutional leftist organizations where they've stacked, their ideologues within these institutions, among other bad ideologies. You'll find them with Muslim Brotherhood people, CCP operatives, people, with anti-Western attitudes tend to conglomerate in the same places in our society. So that's more the explanation of it is they managed to gain purchase on the political left. They have a lot of money because they were funded either by Pakistan or China now, whoever it is, maybe both. So you have money, you have political infiltration, and you have hardline ideologues looking to do the infiltrating. You have money behind it, and you manage to get onto the institutions through another ideology, and now you have a widespread Khalistani problem that seems to have popped up out of nowhere to a lot of Canadians. But as my colleague outlined, it's been 40 years in the making.
And the thing is that not many people know about this within Canada, that 329 lives were lost that fateful day 40 years ago. In fact, when a commemoration ceremony was held, that was led, of course, by the Indian Embassy in Canada itself, this was disrupted by Khalistanis over there. Meanwhile, of course, in stark difference, we've seen our parliamentarians this side around honoring the victims, of course, and all of them in a united manner, standing up, observing a 1-minute silence. Coming back to Monica Verma with regards to this, what do you make of this united pitch that has been made? We've seen a lot of differences erupt in the parliamentary proceedings over the last couple of days, of course, with regards to domestic matters. But when it comes to this one matter, everybody stood up, observed silence, paid their tributes to the victims.
Yes, absolutely. This was one of those rare moments of unity that we see in Indian Parliament these days. But of course, one of the reasons is because as an Indian, we can feel the pain of those 329 victims of the Kanishka bombing. And the reason why so many Canadians still don't know that something like this happened, I have a personal theory to it, and I think it's not my only personal theory. Many people believe this, that because those 329 victims were indeed Canadian citizens, but they were of Indian origin. So the blood that was shed, it was not of your, so there is a racist angle to it. And I'm not saying it only because of my own imagination. It's a well-proven theory that, if 329 white men were involved in this incident, things would have been turned out to be very different. And which is the reason why an Indian parliament sees a moment of unity. But on the other hand, the same Khalistani terrorists who are adopting the methods of Islamic terrorists are given the badge of honor of a freedom of speech warrior, but the Islamist terrorists are not given that badge, and they are, they don't have that legitimacy. They can always be killed, and no media will celebrate them, no parliament will hold a moment of honor for them. So I think this is where the difference lies, that when the victim is a brown person, the sensitivities and the sensibilities, they come down. The pain which is caused is not at the same level. As of, I would also like to respond to a brief question that you would ask to my colleague here, was that why Indian media is only covering it and there is no international coverage of it. See, Indian media needs to get out of this mindset that any other media in the world will be fighting the war that we have to fight. And that's simply because, narrative making and narrative shaping is a very, very important part of international politics. It has always been a very important part, but in today's date, it's even more important because narratives are determining how we will be reacting to certain things. So I think what happened to Indians on foreign shores and what that foreign government did with India and how those, the fate of those victims panned out and the justice that was not met is something which troubles India, is something which is troubling India even today when we as Indians look at television or we watch news reports or we read websites. What we find is very, very appalling, very, very troubling that a prime minister of a country is okay the parliament of a country is okay giving a moment of honor to someone like Nijar. So I think that is our problem. We can't expect the world will think of all problems as their problems. So I think it's high
and do you
time.
think this sort of exposes the inherent bias of international media when it comes to covering India in particular?
They have never hidden their biases. They have never, we can't even call them hypocrites. And the reason is simple, because this is how power works. Media is a very, very powerful tool of exerting power, of gaining power, of legitimizing what you do with that power. So I don't think Western media has ever been ashamed of using power to help their states. Now I'll give you another example. Just look at what's happening with the German state media and compare that with how the German government treats India. On ground, there is a lot of anti-India coverage. The free press, the so-called free press in a democracy, is used every day to attack India. It's used every day to meddle in India's internal affairs. But when it comes to cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, or it comes to military cooperation, or it comes to any other kind of cooperation, if they are selling electronic vehicles, I'm sure they will be looking at India as a prospective partner. So I think when it comes to actually doing business, the governments will be nice, the governments will be sweet. But when it comes to using tools to keep India always on tenterhooks, so that we do not assert ourselves globally, so that we always have that element of guilt while dealing with them, they will definitely use their usual, the usual tools in their toolkit, and which are India is not treating its minorities right, India does not respect the humanitarian concerns of its people, the human rights of the minorities are being targeted every day. I think this is what happens. And there's another example, the US CIRF report that just come last week. Schools in United States are making Bible compulsory. And we in India can never think of making the Bhagavad Gita a compulsory text. But despite this, it's India which is blamed for not being secular enough. And it's United States that has the right, that has the power to tell us what to do with our minorities. So I think this power differential is already there. The Western press is using this power differential. They are exploiting it to the T. And I think it's high time Indian media recognizes its outward role more than its inward role. So I really congratulate your channel for, taking up this campaign and making sure that a message is sent to the entire world that not just Canadian Parliament can hold a moment of silence, but Indian Parliament can also hold a moment of silence for the actual victim.
All right, with that, I would like to thank you as well as Mr. Boardman for taking out time speaking to us on the broadcast. And on that note, viewers, my colleagues have also in fact spoken to Congress Member of Parliament Shashi Tharoor as well as RJD Member of Parliament Manoj Jha with regards to the 1-minute tribute that was held in the Sansad Bhavan yesterday itself. Let's in fact listen in to what they have to say.
NewsX has been covering Kanishka bombing issue and continuously raising it. And now the Rajya Sabha has held a silence, 1-minute silence for the, Kanishka bombing victims. So how do you see this?
I think we should have done the same thing in the Lok Sabha. Pity we didn't so far. Maybe we'll do it tomorrow. Because obviously that was a terrible, terrible tragedy. Over 365, I think, people killed. 328, okay. And to this day, no satisfactory solution has been found. The trial in Canada was completely botched up. There was no real conclusion. I must say that there is a great deal that remains to be resolved. And as you know, the echoes of that continue out of Canada and as poisoning Indian and Canadian relations as well. So it's a very important and tragic situation. The biggest bombing affecting an Indian airliner, the biggest tragedy affecting our citizens as well as Canada's citizens, and bring us together in this shared grief. A terrible situation all around. So I would say that the moment of silence is a very, very good gesture on the part of the Rajya Sabha, and I do wish we do the same in the Lok Sabha.
हमारे साथ बातचीत करने के लिए आरजेडी सांसद मनोज हैं। सर, कल बहुत सालों के बाद राज्यसभा में न्यूज़एक्स ने स्टोरी दिखाई कनिष्का फाइल्स को लेकर के, तो कल मौन रखा गया, श्रद्धांजलि दी गई, क्या कहेंगे?
क्या जाहिर तौर पर हम सब ने उस दौर को सुना है, देखा है, और एक ब्लॉट था, और मैं समझता हूँ कि पूरे सदन की ओर से जो श्रद्धांजलि दी बहुत ही गरिमामय चीज़।